So today's lecture will be discussing chapter 3 of the outline, which is investment regulation in Ethiopia. This is probably one of the most important aspects of learning about the investment law in Ethiopia. BITs, of course, are critical because we need to understand they're part of the legal system. But when it comes to really understanding how investment is regulated in Ethiopia, this section is the most important. Especially for me as a practitioner, we advise a lot of clients coming into Ethiopia, and this is the piece of legislation, the investment regulation and the investment proclamation that we use. So understanding the contents, the details, and how it's interpreted, and how it's applied on the ground is quite critical. And really, graduating, either working in a law office or becoming a lawyer or an investment advisor, this is something that you need to understand. And as I mentioned before, this law came into effect last year in 2020. It's been revised since 2018, but the proclamation came into effect in 2020, so as the regulation. So we'll go through that. But just to start up, we'll go through a bit of a history. I won't dwell much on history, only to the extent that it will give you a highlight of how our investment law has evolved over the years. There are some changes. We've experimented with quite a number of approaches to investment admission and regulation. So to the extent it's relevant, I will discuss briefly about that, but much of our time will be discussing the investment proclamation and regulation. So last week, just a bit of a recap for those of you who are not here. We discussed about the economic theories of investment. We talked about the classical theory, talked about the dependency theory, and also the middle path theory. We also had a guest lecture that tried to sell to us how much of an importance investment is. So we understand that investment plays a big role in economic development and also in economic growth. And to the extent that countries really take charge of how they regulate the way investment is being admitted into the country and how it's being administered, we can really leverage the extent of the benefit that we will get out of our investment. So we really discussed how much of an importance that is to every country. And so today we will talk about the investment regulation in Ethiopia. A bit of a history. So, as I'm sure you've learned in other courses, the way our legal development, our legal regime developed is quite a reflection of the way our political system has developed, right? So the modern legal regime that we have now is a reflection of the making of the modern Ethiopian state, which basically started from the imperial government in the 1930s, and then went on during the military government and also the government that we have now, the federal government. So, likewise, our investment law also goes all the way back to the 1950s. By investment law, I mean codified laws, a way of a notice, a decree, a proclamation, or a regulation. Investment activities actually predate the 1950s. There are some investment agreements that Ethiopia has entered with, for example, the US, as early as 1903, that talk about tax incentives, that talk about investment incentives. But in terms of having a clear legal instrument, the first one that we trace back to is the 1950. There was an imperial notice that is published in the Federal Gazeta. It was published as a notice, and it says the encouragement of a notice for the encouragement of foreign capital into Ethiopia. And that notice only had 4 articles, and it talks about the importance of having foreign investment into Ethiopia and the way the government is trying to encourage it. So it gives tax incentives up to a period of 5 years. For those investments coming into Ethiopia, they would be granted a 5-year tax incentive. Those investments that are coming to Ethiopia would be eligible for import tax duties, waiver of import tax duties. It gave them a guarantee to repatriate their funds in the profits that they were making. A very typical clauses that you also find in our current investment legislation. So this was as far back as 1950s. So remember what 1950s and other parts of the world what was going on. As we discussed in the BIT section, 1950s was just after the end of the Second World War. And most of African countries at that point were still under colonization. They didn't even have, let alone an investment legislation, they didn't even have control over their own resources, right? And so this is quite progressive for the time, for Ethiopia to have sort of a legal framework that tried to really bring into foreign investment as far back as 1950. And also when you place it in the context of where our legal development was at the time, this was quite a sort of a recognition that the government, the imperial government at the time, gave to the importance of FDI. Because if you recall, most of our legislations were codified in the 1960s, right? The civil code, the commercial code, the penal code, all of them came from 1960s up to 1965. So that even, and then the constitution that was first drafted in the 1930s was only amended in 1955. So it shows you that the importance that the imperial government gave to allowing foreign investments to come in by issuing this decree in 1950. Then for a couple of years, I would say decades, the next legislation that came about was in 1963. In 1960, so we had this notice, sort of recognizing, foreign investors to come in, giving them incentives and so on. And then in 1960, there was an actual investment proclamation, probably the first of its kind for Ethiopia, that really exhibited, a modern type of investment legislation. It was called the Investment Proclamation 1963, and had all the hallmarks of what a typical investment regulation looks like. Recognizes foreign investments' role in economic development. It was quite expanded, had a lot of articles, and it even forms an investment committee that would look and administer how these foreign investments were brought into the country and administered. That legislation came up in 1968, it was amended once in 1966, a bit of an amendment. It had some, the amendments had a bit of an expansion of the role of the investment committee, especially. How foreign investors can really approach the investment committee to really handle some of their issues. And it also talked about the type of investors that would be encouraged. It sort of had like a minimum capital of amount of money. If a certain investor invested, it says 400,000 Ethiopian birr at the time, they would be eligible to more incentives. So they had this bit of a details, which we also have now, but this came in 1963, which at the time was considered one of those very progressive investment laws in Ethiopia. And this is, again, in the context of Ethiopia not having that colonial history, not dealing with a lot of privatization or nationalization that other Latin American and African countries were going through. So it really had that policy and legal freedom to come up with its own legal instrument that allowed how investors could be treated and how they could be administered. Then fast forward, this is 1963, and as you all know, 1974, there was a revolution, a military coup d'etat happened, and then all forms of private property were suspended. Basically, the communist ideology that was introduced in the country did not recognize any form of private property, not for domestic investors or not for foreign investors. Private property was nationalized, so the idea of an investment law did not take root at that point. So we had like a period of sort of a drought for the 17 years until the new government the transitional government came in 1991. So in 1991, we had a transitional, as you recall in our history, we had a transitional government for 5 years before the current constitution was introduced in 1996. But in 1991, as soon as the transitional government came into place, one of the first legislations that the Transitional Council, or the Transitional House, deliberated upon and enacted upon was the investment law. As early as 1992, the first investment proclamation was passed to allow investment to come into the country. This is a transitional government proclamation. And also at the time, you'd note that Ethiopia sort of moved away from the communist socialist ideology to a mixed economy ideology, and it was also liberalized to some degree. The economy was liberalized, private property was recognized, and both domestic and foreign investors were invited to come in. So the first legislation, 1992, introduced that investment proclamation. It had, again, similar hallmarks of what we have today, but it was a bit of a very broad and very short proclamation. That proclamation stayed until 1996, until the government was constituted and a new constitution was introduced. Once the constitution was introduced, again, the investment proclamation was amended and a new proclamation was introduced. So since then, between 1991 and today, 2021, in a period of 30 years, we had like 4 phases of investment law evolution. I would say that a lot of other countries' investment laws are quite dynamic. They evolve because the nature of investment, the global and the international trend to investment really changes quite quickly. A lot of countries change their investment law very, very quickly, depending on how things are on the ground. Ours has not been that dynamic. So we had the first one in 1991, then the next one came in 1996, 5 years later, and then the next one came in 2002, about 8 years later, 7, 8 years later. I'll discuss some of the features of these legislations when we discuss some of the provisions of the current law. Then after 2002, it was after 10 years later, in 2012, that we got a new investment law. 2012. There is a big difference between the 2002 law and the 2012 law, which I'll discuss later. And then after 2012, the current law came about, which is 8 years later. Of course, there were some amendments, there were some, board decisions that tried to really accommodate some of the changes on the ground, but our law could be considered as quite static in a way that it stays there for a long time, And our new legislation actually tries to address that by really deferring a lot of the detailed investment administration matters, either to a regulation or also to the decision of the board or the investment commission. That way, when you have an institutions and regulatory bodies that are empowered to make laws, territorial type of laws like directives and circulars, then you can accommodate a lot of the requests or a lot of the practical challenges that you face on the ground by not necessarily going through amendment process of the proclamation. So part of the way that the current law has addressed this issue is really empowering and deferring a lot of the rulemaking authorities to the Investment Commission and also to the Investment Board. Okay, so this is what our evolution. I'll discuss in more detail as we go on. So what's a typical national investment legislation constitutes? You'd note that when we discussed the BITs in the last couple of weeks, BITs only apply to post-investment, once the investors get into the country. They do not really regulate how investments are admitted into the country, right? So, and a lot of those BITs also differ that the definition, for example, of investment or the definition of investors are always subject to how the national legislations interpret them. So what are the typical contents of these national legislations, if you ask? The first one is rules on investment admission. By rules, I mean, so who is allowed to invest where? Who is restricted from investing on what sectors? How do we define investment? How do we define investment? What are the minimum requirements that investors must fulfill before they're even allowed to come in? So there are some basic minimum preconditions that investors must fulfill before they're even admitted into the country. These are called investment admission rules. The second one is protection and guarantees, which we discussed in BITs. What protection does the national legislation give? What guarantees does it grant? What incentives does it grant to the foreign investors once they're inside and setting up? And the third one is the rules on investment administration or investment management. These are quite procedural stuff. Like what type of permits do you need? What type of licenses do you need? How often do you need to renew it? What kind of documents do you have to provide? Which regulatory agencies you have to go through? These are quite procedural stuff, but they ensure that there is a certain level of certainty and predictability on how the regulatory environment works. So these are quite embedded in the law on how investment is actually regulated. And then when the investors actually face an issue, how is it dealt with? So this is very important, because when investors come in with a lot of their capital, when they come with a lot of their money to invest in the country, they need to know the full cycle. How are we going to get in? And then once we get in and start operations, how are we going to face challenges? So investors, when they do their risk analysis and risk assessment, all of these things they do a due diligence on, from the very beginning up to a point of even exit. They may decide that they've made enough money and they would like to exit the economy. So how do they exit the economy? This is something they do a full due diligence on before they commit any of their resources into the country. So part of the advisory for any good lawyer or any investment lawyer is to understand how the investment works from the entry up to exit. So you need a full understanding of how the law treats investors, how it encourages them to come in, and once they come in, what type of care and protection that it provides, and then when they try to exit, what kind of resources that it allocates to help them facilitate their exits. So these are the three typical things that a national legislation incorporates: investment admission rules, protections, guarantees and incentives, and investment administration procedures. Okay, so the first one, investment admission. The investment admission basically follows two types of ways. Typically two ways. One is called a positive list approach, and the other one is a negative list approach. This is, when we talk about investment admission, we're talking about sectors. Sectors that investors are allowed to come in, or sectors they are allowed to come in or encouraged to come in. So the positive list approach says it lists down the sectors where foreigners are allowed to come in only. Meaning there is an exhaustive list, a table of sectors. It could be agriculture, manufacturing, ICT, and etc. It's a positive list in which investors are allowed to come in. Any sector that is not included in that list is closed for foreign investors. That's what a positive list approach says. You can only come in and invest in A, B, C, D sectors. Otherwise, you're not allowed to come in. Those sectors that are not listed are only allowed for domestic investors. This is called a very restrictive approach to foreign investment. The flip side, approach is the negative side. It lists down only the sectors that are not allowed for foreign investors. They would say you're only prohibited from investing in A, B, C, D sectors. Otherwise, everything else is open. When it prohibits those sectors, what it does is it reserves it to domestic investors. For example, Ethiopia for the longest time has not allowed investors into the banking sector, right? So it lists down, you cannot invest in banking, you cannot invest in insurance, you cannot invest in retail, A, B, C, D. The rest, you can invest in anything. So this is a very liberal approach. Liberal approach in a way that it only lists down the restrictions. Whereas the positive list approach is very restricted because it only lists down the areas that they can invest in. Agriculture and manufacturing, that's it. So for a lot of our history, in the last 30 years, almost, except for one time, we have followed the negative listing approach, in which we have laid down or listed down those sectors that are restricted for foreign investors. And then within those restrictions, there are sub-restrictions. So when we restrict foreign investment from for others, for example, there are some sectors that would be reserved for the government only, meaning domestic investors themselves cannot engage in the sectors. It is only the government that can do that. These are mostly high-level infrastructure projects, for example, aviation, such as Ethiopian Airlines, energy, such as the Ethiopian Energy, the utility company, telecommunication until very recently. Oh, sorry. Actually, telecommunication for the longest time has been JV with government, although it never materialized. But aviation, energy, postal services, and all of this is something that the government had monopoly over, even to this day. So the law says, in the actual legislation, that these sectors A, B, C, D is an area that only government can engage in, which basically means that foreign investors are not allowed, and even domestic investors are not allowed. And there will be a second subsection, which would be an area that would be reserved for a joint venture with the government. Yes, you can invest in those sectors, but only in partnership with the government. There were typically two sectors that were over the last 30 years. This has been removed now. The production of weapons and communication. Telecom services has been reserved to joint venture with the government. Now communication is 100% liberalized. It's no longer a government monopoly. It's actually has been liberalized. The production of weapons, it's still an area that is reserved for joint venture with the government. And the third subsection is domestic investors. We'll discuss about who is a domestic investor in the definitions on the next section. And then they would have a list of sectors in which only domestic investors may invest in. This is normally a bit longer, ranging between 20 to 30. Our current investment law has 32 sectors. So domestic investors, only domestic investors may engage in the sectors. So banking, insurance, retail, wholesale, and all of those sectors, because the list is important, because unless it is listed in these restrictions, the foreigners can come in and invest. Because the negative list only lists down the restrictions, not the permitted areas. So unless it's in these lists, it means automatically it's open for foreign investors. So even the very small and small and medium businesses like shoe shining, hair salon, bakeries, restaurants, tea rooms, and all of this have to be listed in this list to allow them to be protected, to allow them only to be invested by domestic investors. The last list is JV with domestic investors. So we have these three lists, and there are some sectors. We didn't have it in much of our laws. We have it in our current law, in which the law tries to encourage partnership with local investors. So it would allocate some sectors for foreigners to come in. Yes, you can come in, but you can only come in if you have local partners as shareholders. So there are some here, which we will discuss later. But these are basically some of the categories that a negative listing incorporates. So much of our laws, out of the 4 legislations that we had in 1992, 96, 2002, 2012, and well, we have now 2020. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 of them followed the negative list approach. The only exception to this is the 2012 legislation, which was replaced by the current legislation, that followed the positive list approach. It's surprisingly, this law was in place for 8 years, from 2012 until very recently. It was considered very restrictive because it listed down the sectors that were allowed for foreigners. There was an attached table to the investment law that listed down all the sectors where foreign investors could come in. So mostly it was in agriculture, manufacturing, and to some extent ICT. So as far as foreign investors were concerned, when they're trying to invest into the country, the first thing they look at is look at this list. Is my business listed in here or not? If it's not listed, then then they cannot come in. But in addition to this list, as far as foreign investors are concerned, there were also another list that had some parts of a negative list approach. So the 2012 law is primarily considered as a positive listing approach, but it also had some aspects of negative listing. So some say it's a hybrid type of law because it incorporates both. Meaning, while the FDI, the foreign investors, were restricted to this table, there were also other restrictions for domestic investors. I'll come to that. So when you consider the domestic investors aspect, this law had some sectors that was only reserved for Ethiopian nationals, and some sectors that was open for diaspora. And there were some sectors that was reserved for government and joint venture for government. So while primarily it is a positive listing approach, foreigners would only look at this list to know whether they're allowed or not. Domestic investors also had to look at the negative list, which was part of the law either, as well. The first one is the sectors that were reserved for Ethiopian nationals. Ethiopian nationals means basically Ethiopian diaspora cannot invest in. This was mainly banking, media, legal services, and some other sectors, about 7 or 8 of them. Only Ethiopians can invest in. The diaspora, they can invest in any sector, except those that are reserved for Ethiopian nationals. The government, it took some of these sectors that were traditionally since the 1990s reserved for the government and maintained them in this list as well. So much of aviation and energy and postal services, all of those big infrastructure projects were still retained for government, even under this positive listing. The same thing for JB. Weapons and communication were reserved for government. So the basic thing that was changed was it retained all of these negative listing, but instead of opening it up the rest as a negative listing would typically do, it introduced a positive listing for foreign investors to invest in, and really introduced this very restrictive table of investments where foreign investors are only allowed in. If there is any gray area in between, it would be construed as an area that's not allowed for foreign investment. So this was a very conscious policy decision that was made at the time by the government. You would note that although this law is considered very, very restrictive and quite archaic, if you look at other laws in global terms, Ethiopia actually registered the most investment under this legislation. Our investment actually tripled, and we were able to register the biggest investment during this law. We became the second highest FDI recipients in Eastern Africa, in Africa totally, and the number one FDI recipients in East Africa. So there are pros and cons to this approach, right? Last week it was discussed that a lot of the investment priority was geared towards agriculture and manufacturing. And that policy priority had brought in some really positive results in terms of really attracting manufacturing investors and also some investors in the agriculture. So it had succeeded in bringing about good investors in this sector, but it could have done more. The argument that was made in favor of shifting from the positive to the negative approach was that yes, while positive listing was able to attract really priority sector investors, it could have done more by opening it up. So now we've gone back to the negative listing. Our current law has shifted this, so we no longer have a positive listing approach. What we have now is here, which I will discuss as we go on. If you have any questions here on the listing, it's a bit of a gymnastics. It needs to understand understand it, but when you read through the investment proclamation and the investment regulation, it becomes more clear, especially the investment regulation, because you'd find all the listings in here. So that's one of the first things that you need to consider whenever a foreign investment comes into a country is whether that sector is allowed for that investor or not. Okay, so quickly before I go into the details of how this is currently regulated, like I said, we changed from the positive to the negative approach now in our current legislation. And I want to give you a bit of a background on the law reform process that we went through when this legislation was drafted. You'd note on the course outline that we were supposed to have a guest lecture to discuss this process, but as we only have like 3 weeks to go for this course, we need to speed up, and if we have time at the end, we will bring in this guest lecture. So I'll just quickly go through that process because I was part of that process too. So that will help you understand why we needed to make the changes that we made in the current law. So 2018, you all know that, the political change that happened in our country, and that was introduced, a lot of the reform activities that were introduced in 2018. The new government of the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has really launched an economic reform agenda that needed to be aligned with the current legal framework in the country. Some of these rationales were at the policy level, and some of them were at the practical level. So at the policy level, some of the political and the economic decisions that needed to be taken into consideration when the investment regime was being discussed are, number one, if you recall, the government decided that it was going to open up and liberalize a lot of the economic activities that were closed for foreign investment. So part of that decision was, one of the first decisions, if you recall, was that privatization of Ethio Telecom, privatization of Ethiopian Airlines, privatization of the Ethiopian Electric Utility. This is one of the main decisions, and the Sugar Corporation were one of the main decisions that were made at the time. So in order to effect that law, this law has to change. The investment law says aviation, energy, and the communication is for government and for JV government. Unless we change this law, then those decisions cannot be effected. So the liberalization, the privatization discussions that were going necessitated the need to revise the investment law, number one, at the policy level. Number two, if you recall, the Prime Minister's office launched what is called the Ease of Business Doing initiative. So the Ease of Business Doing is an initiative of the World Bank, which is used as a tool to attract investment into countries. So it's a ranking system which ranks countries on the basis of their friendliness to foreign investment. So Ethiopia has notoriously done very bad on that list. Out of 180 countries, we're usually on 160 or 170s. We're really very bad on that ranking. And this ranking has been known to influence investors in their business decision making. And a lot of the issues that comes when we're on that ranking, when Ethiopia is one, we have the positive listing, and then a lot of investors that are already in the ground really complain about issues with tax authorities, with customs issues, and all of that makes doing business in Ethiopia very difficult. So as part of this drive to attract investment, the Prime Minister's office launched what is called an Ease of Doing Business initiative, which basically targets in addressing a lot of these bottlenecks that really stands in the way of investments being facilitated, and ultimately improving our ranking in that World Bank index from whatever 170 to Rwanda is one of the countries that has made immense improvement. They used to be on the same similar ranking as like us, but through a series of reforms that they were able to achieve on the ground, they improved that ranking to, I think currently they're about 35. Their ranking has improved over 100 places to reach 35, and that has had a direct impact on how investment has flowed into the country. So this initiative aimed to achieve similar results, and which meant that a lot of the restrictions and a lot of the, the detailed provisions that were there in the investment law had to be revised. Things that were considered very restrictive or as a bottleneck to how investments are facilitated had to be revised. These are part of the considerations that the investment team that was working on this legislation took into consideration. And there were two other decisions also, political decisions that also had to be taken into account. One is the membership to the World Trade Organization and the membership to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Again, these are regional and global agreements that deal with trading and trade and services that had a direct impact on how investment is facilitated. So these are membership in WTO and our membership in the ACFTA has to be aligned with the way our investment is handled on the ground. So therefore, all of these considerations at the policy level had to be considered when the conversations around the new investment law were considered. This at the policy level, and at the very practical level, again, like I mentioned, the positive listing approach really achieved some results, but it also introduced a lot of issues, a lot of challenges with the way investment was administered. So the team had to look on the ground and really address what were the issues with the previous law at the practical level. How was the law being interpreted at those desk officers who handled investment at the Investment Commission? How did they really interpret when they look at the schedule, whether an investor is allowed or not? So at the practical level, a bit of a diagnostics was done on really with the idea of addressing real-time problems of investors when it comes to applying the law. So one of it was, how was the positive listing approach? How would it benefit if we move to the negative listing approach? And how would the investment be really facilitated if the negative listing approach was introduced? And then also between 2012 and 2020, although the investment law was changed, there were a number of amendments and a number of board decisions. The investment board is the highest decision-making body on investment matters. We'll discuss that when we discuss investment administration. But it was coming up with a lot of decisions that was, in a way, amending the proclamation and the regulation at the piecemeal level. So these were all over the places. So whenever an investment lawyer and an advisor tries to consult investor, not only did you have to look at the proclamations and regulations, you'd also have to trace down all the board decisions that have been made in regards to investment. So there were a lot of activities that were not comprehensive. So there was a need to bring all those legislation, the treasury levels, the directives, the board decisions, some of the amendments that were made to the proclamation and the regulation, and bring it together and do a one comprehensive legal instrument. The other thing is, when we look at the global trends, the global investment trend and the global investment environment, FDI has become extremely competitive, meaning that there are limited resources that foreign capital has, and they look into the different countries that have very friendly environment where the return on investment is high. So the competition for investment has gone up, so there was a need to keep in with that trend. Sometimes we'd like to think that, if we open up our gates to foreign investment, all foreign investments will come and flood our country and they'll take over all the domestic jobs. That's not the case. The case is actually very competitive, and there has to be an advantage in comparison to Kenya, in comparison to Rwanda, that we have to be able to offer for them to come in. So there was really a need to really have a deep thinking and conversation around, so what is the best thing that we could offer so that investors won't go to Kenya or they won't go to Rwanda? And how can we really modernize our investment regime in a way that really facilitates investment? So these were some of really practical issues that we had to look into, really removing some of the restrictions, some of the really archaic provisions that really did not serve much of a policy goal, a public policy goal, that was just there to only put a bit of a on how the investor really operates on the ground. So those provisions had to be removed. And the other one is really introduce a robust dispute settlement mechanism. When we look at how investors are operating the ground, we put a lot of focus on bringing them in. Come in, we will give you incentives, we'll waive your minimum capital, we will facilitate all your investments. But the most important part is, okay, they've come in, but how is the environment after they come in? How are they really operating on the ground? And we see a lot of disputes between the tax authority, with the customs authority, and that really frustrates a lot of investors. So a lot of focus has also been given, how do we handle investment disputes or complaints that comes from investment against the investment commission itself, against other agencies of government, be it tax or customs or labor, and how do we really create a system where there is a comprehensive dispute settlement environment. And finally, and ultimately, one of the big goals of the new investment law is really changing the perception that Ethiopia is not open for investment. When a lot of the global FDI capital looks into Africa, most of the time they would look into South Africa when it comes to Southern Africa. East Africa is dominated by Kenya, West Africa is dominated by Nigeria. So Ethiopia was not really part of the big game as a destination for investment, although we have the biggest population, the biggest working capital in a way, in terms of labor, a big domestic market that could really be leveraged, and a lot of other comparative advantage when compared to Kenya. But the perception out there is not as lavish as it is for Kenya. So there was this really drive to change that perception that we're open for business. Yes, we can do business, and we can also bring in investors and also handle them. So some of these policy and practical considerations were made when the current investment law was drafted. So let's dig in. I'm sure you all have the investment proclamation and regulation on hand. Yes? Okay. Those of you who don't have it, you can share with your. I'll also try to read it out, some of them. Okay, first let's look into, we talked about investment objectives last week, if you recall. So what's the benefit of having a foreign investor? We talked about that, and part of those considerations in our current law you see in the preamble to the investment proclamation, and also Article 5, which lists down the things that we want to achieve through this investment proclamation. Typically all proclamations would have an objective they want to achieve, and ours also has a similar objective. So look at Article 5. If you look at Article 5, it says, number 1, we want to enhance our competitiveness in the national economy by promoting investment in productive and enabling sectors. We want to create more job opportunities. We want to increase our foreign exchange earnings. We want to save foreign exchange by import substitution. We want to develop and exploit our natural resources. Create an integrated economy by strengthening intersectoral and foreign domestic investment. So these are the main objectives. And when you look at this in comparison with what we discussed last week, in terms of investment playing a role in economic development, so basically this is what it plans to achieve. And I would say that these investment objectives are quite the same since the 1990s. They all want to accelerate economic development and change the livelihoods of the Ethiopian population. And to the most extent, we've had the same investment objectives for the last 30 years. Obviously, over the years, we've added some more nuanced forms of objectives, such as how we want to transfer technology, how we want to transfer skills, and how we want to create jobs, not just jobs, but better and quality jobs. We can create very low-skilled jobs for a very highly educated society, but that's not the intention. The intention is to create better and quality jobs. So that's the investment objectives that you would see. And next to that is the scope of application. Look at Article 3. Article 3 says that the investment, always when you look, I'm sure you've learned in other classes as well, that whenever you review or you really examine any proclamation or regulation, the first thing you look at is the scope of application. Who does it apply to? Who does not apply to? Who does it exclude? So the scope of application is critical, and then it says the investment proclamation applies to all investments in Ethiopia. I should note here that when it says all investors, our investment law is not an FDI law. There should be a distinction. It's not a foreign direct investment law. It's an investment law, which means that it applies equally to domestic investors and to foreign investors. Although foreign investors are specially treated by this law, and domestic investors, to the extent that they want to use some of the provisions of the investment law, they will apply, but it's an investment law that applies to both. There's no distinction. Some may think that this is a law that favors foreign investors, but that's not the case. All the incentives, all the benefits, and everything that the investment law grants to foreign investors, it also grants to domestic investors. The only thing that's required is that if you want to benefit from those incentives, you need to get an investment permit from there. You need to be recognized as an investor that's eligible for incentives or protections. So it just adds one layer of requirement in terms of regulatory approval. Otherwise, if you don't want to benefit from those investments, you can simply go on and set up your business, invest into the country without having to interface with this law. So it applies to all investments, both domestic and foreign. But it has an exclusion, meaning it does not apply to the prospecting, the development, and exploitation of natural resources, meaning mining and petroleum in particular. This does not mean that petroleum and minerals are not regulated. They are regulated, except that they're regulated by a different law. They have their own laws. There's a petroleum proclamation, there's a mineral proclamation. So those other legislation, they also talk about investment, foreign investment, and incentives. So they're treated in a special way by a special legislation, so the investment law does not apply to them. So this is a very practical thing that you should note, because if there is an investor that's coming in wanting to invest in the petroleum sector, this law would not apply. So you'd have to look elsewhere on the other legislations to see how that sector is regulated. And also look at Article 4. Article 4, sub 2, talks about some other sectors. It talks about the issuance, renewal, amendment, substitution, and replacement of investment permits. Investment permits, this is for all investment, it's done at the Investment Commission. So the Investment Commission handles all investments that come into the country, including issuing permits, including revoking permits, cancelling permits, renewing permits. All of that is done centrally at the Investment Commission, except for these three sectors. You'll see in Article 4.2, aviation, energy, and communication are excluded from the jurisdiction of the Investment Commission. When it comes to issuing investment permits, interfacing with the investors, these three sectors are excluded. Why do you think these are excluded? Anybody has any idea why these three sectors were chosen for the exclusion? Yes?
I think because they have better expertise and experts that will understand.
Yes. Basically, these are very technical institutions. Not to say others are not, but when it comes to the aviation, energy, and communication, you know, the technical expertise that are needed, the Investment Commission is not considered to have those technical needs. So for those investment applications that come into the country regarding aviation, the Ethiopian Aviation Authority is better placed to handle them. When it comes to investments that are interested in the energy sector, be it hydro, wind, geothermal, or any biomass energy investment applications, the Ethiopian Energy Authority is better placed to handle those applications. Same for the communication. The Communication Authority is a very specialized organ that regulates the communication sector. So investments, any potential investments into the communication sector are better handled by the Ethiopian Communication Authority. So while the general law applies to the sector, to these sectors, so the Investment Commission has deferred some of its obligation and some of its responsibilities to these agencies that it thinks are better placed to handle them. So for these sectors, again, if you come across any investor coming in and wants to invest in energy, so the place you would go to is not the Investment Commission, but the Ethiopian Energy Authority. But only for cases of investment issuance, renewal, cancellation, and so forth. Okay, and then the next one. You'll see in the definition under Article 3, no, sorry, we've gone through. Let's see the definition of investment, how investment is defined. Yeah. So we've looked at scope of application, what is excluded, and who does what in what sector, right? So that's the first one. The second one is how is investment defined? So we looked, remember on BITs, it's the definition of investment under BITs usually defers it to local legislation. It would say that subject to local rules and regulations, investments shall be defined as so and so, right? So how does our law really defines investment? It's the expenditure of capital in cash or in kind or in both by an investor to establish a new enterprise or to acquire in whole or in part or to expand or upgrade an existing enterprise. And further, Article 2, Sub 3 defines what capital is. And capital means local or foreign currency, negotiable instrument, machinery or equipment, building, working capital, property right, intellectual property right, or other tangible and intangible business assets. So anybody notices any difference between the way investment is defined in our national legislation and the way we've seen it defined in BITs? Anyone? That's one, okay. For example, can debt be, or debt or debentures, can it be considered as an investment? And a lot of our BITs, debt or loans are considered an eligible form of investment. Would that be incorporated under our law? Notice how it says means expenditure in capital, in cash or in kind. So the cash could be equity in the form of actual or it could be in a form of debt. However, although the law is quite open in this case, when you actually come and try to process investments in Ethiopia, the initial investment that must come to the country is only recognized in a form of equity and not debt. Meaning the minimum capital, which we will come back to later, that investments must commit, has to be in the form of equity. So that's one thing that you need to consider in the definition of investment. What's the capital that can be recognized? And how is it invested into that vehicle that is being set up? The second part of the investment definition is that the form of investment. So there is the type of investment or the type of funds that go into it, but what are the two types of forms of investment that investors could pursue when they come in? There are two. You see it in the definition of investment. What are the forms? Yes?
The first one is lease, the other one is existing, like you acquire an existing company or they expand or upgrade.
Perfect. Exactly. So investors, when they come in, they can set up their own new enterprise, buy land, build up a factory, and go all the way to setting up their own entities. Or they could come in, do some investigation, look into local companies that are existing local companies, negotiate with them, and either buy shares of those local companies. So the first type of investment, which is setting up a new enterprise, is called a greenfield investment. The second type of investment, which is buying into existing companies, is called a brownfield investment. For the most part, the investment law applies the same way to both investments, but when you come procedurally, there are some variations. The way it's administered. In terms of admission, they're both admitted the same way. The same sector restriction applies. If it's a restricted area, then you cannot buy it, whether it's greenfield or brownfield. For example, if it's, say, banking is restricted, right? Meaning you cannot set up a new bank. You can't even buy shares into existing banks. So it applies both. Say if it's a minimum capital requirement, if you're setting a new capital, the minimum capital requirement, which we will see later, is $200,000. Then you have to commit $200,000 in the new enterprise. If you're buying share into existing enterprise, then at least you have to buy $200,000 worth of shares from the existing enterprise. So it applies the same way. But there are some procedural differences on how the investment is actually processed, if it's new and if it's if it's buying into existing enterprises. But we'll see that also later. The other form is, we looked at the form of enterprise. The next one is the form of enterprise. We looked at the forms of investment. The other is the form of enterprise. The forms of enterprise for foreign investors or for any investors is under Article 2, Sub 2, which defines what an enterprise is. It's any undertaking that's established for profit. And Article 8 looks into the forms of enterprise that foreign investors may pursue. So there are 4 types you look at. It could be a sole proprietorship, it could be one person or one individual. It could be an enterprise established in Ethiopia. An enterprise could be any form of business that are recognized under our commercial code, any one of those 6 enterprises. But typically, it's most of the time either private limited company or share companies that foreign investors use when they come in. But it could be any of the partnerships that are recognized under the commercial law. And the other one is public enterprises. This is for state-owned, 100% state-owned enterprises. And they could also be cooperatives. So these 4 forms of enterprises or legal personalities are recognized when they come in. For the most part, I would say, the typical form that is pursued is the second one. It's an enterprise established in Ethiopia or abroad. They would establish a PLC or a shared company in Ethiopia with the minimum shareholders to be able to use that enterprise as the investment vehicle. Okay, next. Next, definition of investor. Article 2.4. Oh, first Article 2.4 says that investor, it could be either a domestic or a foreign investor. Only two types of investors. And then it goes on to list who a domestic investor is and who a foreign investor is. So I have a question. So this is a very, very critical part of the investment law, understanding the investment law. You need to read through who domestic investors are. So look through domestic investors and tell me if it's all clear, or explain to me what F, H, and I mean. I think the first A, B, and C are quite clear, who a domestic investor is, but what does H, F? F, H, and I. So domestic investors, we need to include the first one. Ethiopian nationals are automatically, obviously, domestic investors. Ethiopian companies formed by Ethiopians are domestic investors. The government can be an investor, so they invest in a lot of sectors. The government-owned public state-owned enterprises are also recognized as domestic investors. Cooperative societies set up in Ethiopia, as per the relevant law, are also considered domestic investors. Probably a bit of a tricky part is the F, H, and I. The F is a foreign national or foreign enterprise treated as domestic investor as per the relevant law. Is this clear? What does this mean? Or international treaty ratified by Ethiopia? Yes?
It is an investment guaranteed by national treatment under international bilateral treaties.
Ashi? Anyone else? It says a foreign national or a foreign enterprise treated as a domestic investor, not given protection. It's a foreign national, but it's treated as a domestic investor. Yes?
I think this is referring to foreign investors, foreign nationals of Ethiopian origin.
Yes, that's it. So there is another legislation that recognizes foreign nationals of Ethiopian origin, or as we call them, Ethiopian diaspora, that gives them equal rights as Ethiopian nationals. It's called the Foreign National, I forgot the name of the proclamation, but there is a particular proclamation that grants Ethiopian diaspora or Ethiopian foreign nationals of the Ethiopian origin equal rights as Ethiopian nationals. Except there are some exceptions under that law. They cannot vote, they cannot be elected, and etc. But in terms of investment, they are recognized as domestic investors. So this article sub F refers to that law and gives the Ethiopian diaspora the same treatment as the others, as the Ethiopian nationals, as the government, as public enterprises, and etc. This is very important because when we talk about the sector listing under the investment regulation, all domestic investors are treated equally. Like I said earlier, in the previous law, the 2012 law, there was a distinction between Ethiopian nationals and the Ethiopian diaspora, meaning that there were sectors that were reserved for Ethiopian nationals, but excluded to Ethiopian diaspora. Under this law, there is no such distinction. So all domestic investors are treated equally, as far as their ability to invest in sectors. So that's why this is very important to look into who is treated as a domestic investor. So the first one is, okay, Ethiopian diaspora, no distinction. H. Oh, sorry. On F there are two legs to F. The first one is a foreign national, foreign enterprise treated as domestic investor as per relevant law. This is the diaspora law that we just talked about. And there's also a second leg, or international treaty ratified by Ethiopia. So there aren't a lot of treaties in which foreign nationals are granted the status of a domestic investor between Ethiopia in other countries, except one. At least to my knowledge, there's only one treaty. That is a treaty between Ethiopia and Djibouti. A treaty between Ethiopia. For the diaspora, there are actually Ethiopians, except that they changed their nationality. But for Djiboutians, they're not Ethiopians. But there's a special treaty between Ethiopia and Djibouti that was signed recognizing Djiboutians as domestic investors. It's called a preferential treaty agreement between Ethiopia and Djibouti that was ratified by the parliament, granting the same status as to Djiboutians as domestic investors. So if you have, for example, this is very critical for those investors coming from Djibouti. You would think that the Djiboutians are foreigners. So you think that, you know, when they ask you for advice on what sectors they can invest in, you would look into those areas that are allowed for foreign investors. But no, they're considered domestic investors. Therefore, they're allowed to invest on areas that also Ethiopians are allowed to invest. So the way you advise Djiboutian investors from the way you advise, say, Kenyan investors is different because they have different status in accordance with the law that we have. So the my knowledge only with Djibouti, but it's also possible we may have other treaties with Sudan or others. But to date, there is one such international treaty ratified by Ethiopia exists with Djibouti. Okay, let's skip H and I. Anybody sees I? Descendants of foreign nationals specified under subarticle 5H of this article, provided that this applies only. So H says a foreign national or foreign enterprise accorded a domestic investment permit as per the laws, which were in effect when the permit was issued, but which have since been repealed and continues to operate in Ethiopia. So this is a bit of a roundabout way of drafting the law, but this article H and I refer to foreign nationals that have lived in Ethiopia for generations. You may all know them. They're foreign nationals, but they have lived in Ethiopia for many, many generations. They have invested millions of dollars, and they're here. These are, say, Rastafarians, Indians, Italians, Armenians. We all know them. We all see them. They are Ethiopians, but their nationalities, they do not have Ethiopian passports, for example, so to say. But they're invested. They're considered as domestic investors. But some of them, for example, have been here for more than 100 years. Some big companies, for example, there's one big manufacturing company that's called the Mohan Industries. The Mohan Industries is an Indian company that was here more than 100 years. Their great-grandfather has set it up, and now their grandchildren are here, and they have a big factory that they're still running. But they're not Ethiopians. They're Indian. They're Indians. So the previous law used to treat them as foreign investors, because they're neither Ethiopian nationals or Ethiopian diaspora. So they faced a lot of issues on how they were treated when they were trying to facilitate for their incentives, when they were trying to facilitate for their customs tax issues, when they were trying to really do their businesses, because the law does not recognize them as domestic investors. They really had a lot of issues. So part of the practical consideration that was made within the investment committee that looked into this law was how do we address the issue of these long-standing, foreigners that have invested in Ethiopia for generations. So the law gave them a specific recognition that to the extent that they were in Ethiopia, have invested in Ethiopia, and were recognized previously during the emperor era or during whichever era as a domestic investor and were permitted to invest in the country, then they will be recognized as a domestic investor. So it gives them a very clear recognition that they will be treated as a domestic investor. So this is something that was introduced in this law. It wasn't there before. So it really has expanded the way we understand who domestic investors are. And this is very critical when we discussed sector listing later on. Next category is foreign investors. It's clear. You can read through that. Okay, Okay, so foreign investor is clear. Anybody with a foreign nationality who says that. One question: if there is a company, for example, which is a joint venture between a foreign investor and a domestic investor, would that be considered as a foreign investor or a domestic investor? Yeah.
I think it would be considered a foreign investor because certainly says an enterprise in which a foreign national has an
Yes. So it doesn't matter what percentage of the foreign participation is in a company. If you have one foreign investor, or if you have a foreign investor with only one share in the company, then that company automatically becomes a foreign investor. The law does not make any distinction as to the threshold of the investment amount or the share of ownership in the company. The minute you introduce a foreign investor, as it's defined in the law, then that company becomes automatically a foreign investment company. Which means that all the protections and the investments and the incentives that are afforded to foreign investors apply, the same way that a foreign investor, any restrictions that affect foreign investors would also apply. And also when it comes to the Ethiopian diaspora, they can be treated as foreign investors if they choose to be. Meaning, or even Ethiopian nationals, if they want to be treated as a foreign investor and use all the benefits from the investment as a choice, they can do that. But you need to go and obtain an investment permit, and you need to be registered as a foreign investor if you want to be treated as a foreign investor and be eligible to that. But this is only applied to the Ethiopian diaspora. And it says in the law, as you read through it, those investors, domestic investors who choose to be treated as foreign investors may do so when they make their applications. Okay, so let's go into the areas of investment. So we've seen the scope of application, we've seen how investment is defined, how investment as investors are defined. Next is the areas of investment. So for this, look at Article 6.1 and 6.2. If you look at Article 6.1 and 2 of the proclamation, it talks about, yes?
Question on this.
Yes.
Under E, it says an Ethiopian permanently residing abroad and preferring treatment as a foreign investor. So if we say that being treated as a domestic investor is more, in some way, preferential, why would this person want to be treated as a foreign investor?
Because domestic investors are not allowed to benefit from some incentives. We will discuss that. For example, foreign investors are the right to be entitled to repatriation. If you invest in dollars, foreign investors, domestic investors, all of them invest in birr, meaning in local currency. They're not required to invest in foreign currency. Foreign investors, they have to invest in foreign currency, but investing in foreign currency would allow them to also repatriate their funds, their profits, and their dividends. So if a domestic investor, you can be a domestic investor, invest in birr, invest in the sectors that are allowed for domestic investors. But if you want to come in and say, I want to invest in dollars, and I also want to take out some of my money, then it would allow you to do that. That's the difference. Okay, Article 6. Article 6, areas of investment. So this is basically the clause that introduces negative listing into our investment regime. It says that subject to the provision of this article, any investor may engage in any area of investment except where it's contrary to law, moral, public health, and security. This is a generic statement. Article 6, sub 2 says areas of investment for joint investment with the government, for domestic investors, and for joint investment with domestic investments shall be specified by regulation. So this is basically what a negative list means. It means that the areas that are reserved would only be listed in the regulation, with the implication under subarticle 3, which says, except for those reserved in accordance with subarticle 2 of this article, all other areas shall be open to foreign investors. So subarticle 2 and 3 say that, legitimize the negative listing approach, stating that those that will be reserved will be listed in the regulation, everything else would be open to foreign investors. So let's go back and look into the regulation and how this is treated, how these sectors are treated. But before that, a bit of if time is allowing, I should ask you, what do you think about sector listing? Meaning, we've had our own policy on reserving some sectors to Ethiopians, reserving closing of FDI to others, but what should Ethiopia's investment administration policy should be? Should we limit some sectors and say that only Ethiopia should invest in this? Should we be like Rwanda and literally open up everything and let investors come in? How should we, what's the best for us?
I guess that shouldn't be open to all of the areas should be reserved for Ethiopia nationally for the government, when there is the interest of the public and also the interest of security of the nation. So it shouldn't be open totally, but it should allow foreign investors to come and invest their capital. That way we can get something out of it. It could be foreign exchange or sharing of information in technology. So that's what
Yes.
I disagree. I think our investment sectors should be open to everything and anything and everyone as well, because currently the economy is really bad as we see it. So we could benefit from the foreign currency, plus we could also benefit from the extra jobs that these investments could bring in. As we can see currently, local investors are not really investing that much, so we really do need the foreign investment to come in and help us.
Maybe if I could get a sense of the room, how many is in favor of liberalizing or opening up as much as possible? How many are more restrictive, saying that a lot of it should be to domestic investors and only allow very few sectors for foreigners? So you mentioned that we should not open up some of the sectors. So what are those sectors? How do we decide who should be open, which one should be closed? What are the considerations that we should need to put? For example, tea rooms, pastries, all the services that we see on the ground, like shops, small boutiques. Should we allow investors to come in and compete with our local investors? What is the threshold that we need to determine? So part of the policy, yes. The policy considerations that are made typically when we really try to consider whether we should let investors in or not. Number one is competition with domestic investors. How much of a capacity that our domestic investors have to be able to compete with these foreign investors coming in. Take the banking sector, for example. It's been the policy of the government not to allow investors to come into the domestic market because we do not have enough domestic banks that are capacitated enough to compete with the others. At the end of the day, we want to encourage competition. We do not want foreign investors to come in and dominate or monopolize the market. But in order to be able to do that, we first have to build the domestic capacity and at least bring up institutions that would be able to compete with these foreign investors. So for the last 20, 30 years, we've allowed banks to open, domestic investors to control banks. We have about 17, 20 banks at the moment. Even now, if we allow foreign banks to come in, then we have domestic banks that would be able to compete with them. So we've used the last 20 years to build those domestic capacity. So part of those sectors that have so far been limited, especially in the financial sector, in the retail, in the wholesale sector, has been done with the intention of really protecting and building the capacity of the domestic investment, with the ultimate objective of opening it up and allowing more competition. And more competition that will ultimately benefit the domestic market. Secondly, the other consideration that is made is regulatory capacity. Okay, yes, we allow foreign investors, foreign banks to come in. So who's going to regulate them? It's going to be the national bank, right? But does the national bank really have the capacity to regulate and really operate in the interest of the public if it allows Barclays and the banks of England to come in? These are extremely advanced, extremely sophisticated institutions in which the regulatory capacity is very weak. So part of the argument was that as we go along opening up our sector, as we go along allowing foreign investors to come in, we also have to build our regulatory capacity to be able to regulate them and make sure that they are operating within the interest of the public. So part of the reason is that, now when you look into the telecom liberalization, part of the program is, yes, liberalizing the telecom sector, allowing these 4 telecom companies to come in, but also setting up the communication authority, which is the regulatory office that's going to be regulating Ethio Telecom and these new entrants, but also building the capacity of the communication authority so that it will be able to regulate these companies and make sure that there is a fair competition and a level playing field within the market. So part of that's the policy objective was that let's build our regulation, our capacity to regulate. The other one is, this is linked to the minimum capital. Yes, we need investors, but we need quality investors. We don't want investors that will come in with $1,000 and invest. We want investors who are big, who can employ, who can introduce technology. So that's why we're going to limit the minimum capital that they must bring in. We may allow the sector to be open, but for them to come in, they have to bring in $200,000 at the very minimum, so that they can create something big. So one way of administering the investment admission is not just limiting the sectors, but also limiting the amount of money that they need to bring. So the other reason is the quality investment. That's why we will not have, for example, very small tea rooms, although tea room is reserved. We will not have very small businesses competing with our very small and medium businesses, because they have to bring in $200,000 and they have to be big. So looking into, before we run out of time, let's look at the investment regulation, how it's been treated, and what sectors are listed. If you have any questions? So look at the investment regulation. So Article 3. So the investment regulation has 3 categories, yeah? The first one is there are sectors, yeah, it is a negative list, like we said. The first one is there are sectors that will be reserved for JV with government. There are sectors that are reserved for domestic investors. And the third one is JV with domestic investors. Even though that we have moved from the positive listing approach and moved to the negative listing approach, even with the negative listing approach, we have really adopted quite a liberal approach, meaning that what was previously a government monopoly is no longer a government monopoly. It actually opens it up with a possibility for a joint venture with the government. So if you look at Article 3, it's the first category. It is any investor may invest in the following investment areas only jointly with the government. So there are 5 sectors there. The manufacturing of weapons, which has always been previously a government monopoly and also with a JV. The import and export of electrical energy, international air transport services, which means aviation, bus rapid transit, and postal services. So all these sectors are currently a government monopoly. There are really no private investors, even domestic investors, engaged in these sectors. What this article allows is if and when the government wants to attract investors and say sell parts of its shares to the government, this law would allow it to do that. So for example, if it wants to sell part of Ethiopian Airlines, which was not allowed previously because it was a government monopoly, the law reserved it to the government, this article would allow it to sell part of its shares. Not the whole. It cannot sell, still cannot sell the entire Ethiopian Airlines because aviation, international air transport services, can only be done in Ethiopia in joint venture with the government. The same for electricity, import and export, not generation and transmission, as was previously the case. Only the import and the export of electricity and the postal services and etc. So this is a very discretionary sort of article that would allow government to privatize or sell its shares if and when it wants to. Does not mean that it's going to do it today or tomorrow, but eventually if it seeks to attract investment, it can do so. Article 4. Article 4 is the most important part of the investment regulation, which reserves sectors to domestic investors. We discussed who domestic investors are earlier, Ethiopian nationals, all of those, the Ethiopian diaspora. These, all the 32 sectors that you see there are areas that only domestic investors may invest in, right? So, but within this reservation, what you should always note are there are exceptions. So when you read at the articles, if you read there's an exception, it means that that exception is allowed for foreign investors. So you could read, when you read it, you have to read it carefully to know whether, so for example, Article 4.1, who can explain to me what's allowed for foreign investors here? And what it means. It talks about banking, insurance, microfinance, businesses, and etc. It says subject to applicable law, banking, insurance, and microfinance businesses, excluding capital goods finance business. Is an area that's reserved for domestic investors. So there are two components here. One, it says subject to applicable law. If a clause says it's a subject to, that provision is subject to applicable law, then you must always refer to the sector legislation that it refers to. So this clause is talking about banking, insurance, and microfinance businesses. These businesses have their own sector legislations. There is a banking proclamation, there is a microfinance proclamation, and there is an insurance proclamation. So this clause sort of differs the level of permission of investment to the extent that it's aligned with those laws. So to really get a full picture of how much of investment, domestic investment is allowed or reserved, you need to cross-refer to these legislations. So it says if it's, the clause is subject to applicable law, banking, insurance, microfinance businesses, excluding capital goods finance businesses is allowed. So one thing I should mention here is when you look at the banking proclamation that was recently amended, so the article says that these are sectors that domestic investors must invest in, right? So when you look into the banking law, it says, although the investment law says domestic investors also includes Ethiopian diaspora and Ethiopian national, the other law says that Ethiopian diaspora can invest in the banking sector only in dollars. They cannot invest in birr. Whereas the investment law basically allows domestic investors to invest in birr, all of them. It's only foreign investors are required to law. So although this investment law gives a sort of a generic and a blanket sort of permission and protection the same way, there are some legislation, sector legislation that may derivate from that, such as the banking legislation, which really restricts the ability of the Ethiopian diaspora to be able to benefit from the same way that the investment law allows them to be. So always get a sense of what sector legislations say when you try to look into whether a sector is allowed or to what extent it's allowed. That's one, under Article 4.1. Number 2, it says excluding capital goods finance business. So there is an exception within the reservation. Yes, banking, insurance, and microfinance institutions are only sectors allowed to domestic investors, except capital goods finance business, which means capital goods finance business is allowed for foreign investors. It's open. within the subset of financial services, capital goods financing lease is an exception because there is another proclamation that specifically deals with capital finance lease business, allowing foreign investors to invest in. Again, when you get, say, a potential investor that comes in and wants to invest into the capital lease business, you need to understand this provision, the provision of the banking sector in general that deals about financial services, and also specifically the capital lease proclamation, to be able to know to what extent it's allowed. So when you read through these articles, there's always nuances and exceptions that you must pay attention to. Just a simple reading may not be helpful in a way that there are some exceptions that need to be seen. For example, Article 4, Sub-Article 4, it talks about wholesale trade, and Article 7, Article 5 talks about retail trade as areas that are reserved for domestic investors. But there are exceptions within those. Yes, wholesale trade, only domestic investors can do. Yes, retail trade, only domestic investors can do, except e-commerce, except e-platforms, which means that foreign investors may engage in those sectors. So when you look into the sector listing in the domestic investors, pay attention to the exceptions within those rules, and pay also attention to any reference or any deference to other legislations, sector-specific legislations, to be able to get a full sense. The third category is the investment areas reserved for joint investment with domestic investors. There's a bit of an error in the way the title of Article 5. Article 5 was drafted. It says investment areas reserved for joint investment with domestic investors. It should not have said foreign investors, but only said with joint investment with domestic investors. So there are about 6 sectors or 7 sectors in which foreign investors are only allowed to invest in partnership with domestic investors. Let's take, for example, domestic air transport services. Sub-Article 1 and Sub-B. Domestic air transport services means, from local air transport services. So foreign investors, as opposed to the international air transport services, which is allowed only in joint venture of the government, if they want to come in and invest in domestic air transport services that would go from Addis to Bahar Dar to Gondar to Makale or all of this, then they could only do it in partnership with local investors or domestic investors. The same for cross-country public transport. The same for urban mass transport, advertisement and promotional services, audiovisual services, motion picture and video recording, accounting and auditing services. These, they can come in, but only if they have partners, domestic partners. And Sub-Article 2 also goes further and limits the share ownership of the foreign investor. It caps it at 49%. So the maximum that the foreign investor may hold is only 49% in this joint venture. It could be less, could be 25%, could be even 1%, but it cannot exceed 49%. So these are the specific sectors that are reserved for joint investment with domestic investors. And you look at our Article 6, which says that everything else that is not listed under Article 4 and 5, under Article 3, 4, and 5 is open for foreign investors. You look at all the exceptions, you look at all the restrictions, and basically say that if anything is not listed in there, then it's open. Yeah, okay, one thing I didn't cover, minimum capital. looked at the sector listing, that's what you need to do. Then the minimum capital. Minimum capital is listed on the investment proclamation, Article 9. Article 9 says, if a foreign investor fully wants to own its business 100%, they must commit $200,000 at the very minimum. First, we look into whether the sector is allowed. If it's open for foreign investors, then that foreign investor must commit $200,000. The law encourages joint investment at all times. Only those few sectors, the 6-7 sectors, are mandatorily allowed to be JV. All other sectors, 100% can be owned by foreigners. But it tries to encourage local partnership by lowering down the minimum capital requirement. So if a foreign investor gets a local partner or a domestic partner, then the minimum capital that is required will go down to $150,000. This is sort of to encourage, domestic partnership. And within the capital, the minimum capital requirement, there's also another exception in which architectural, engineering, and technical consultancy services are required a less amount of minimum capital, which is $100,000 for fully foreign owned and $50,000 for a joint venture with domestic investors. Again, architectural, engineering, and technical consultancy is given as an exception because there is a need to encourage the manufacturing and the industrialization sector to be able to help it with the technical consultancy services. So it's to encourage such services into the sector. The investment law has given it a lower threshold of the minimum capital. This is the same as the previous law, the 2012 law. This article is exactly the same as the previous one. There was a lot of debate within the committees, some arguing that we should waive minimum capital. It's archaic. A lot of countries have waived minimum capital. And some saying we should retain it. If we look at our previous law, the 1992 and 1996 law used to have $500,000 as a minimum capital. That was lowered in 2002 to $200,000. But at the end, the team that was in favor of maintaining the minimum capital sort of won, and it was decided to keep it this way because of the argument that we want not just investors, but quality investors that are able to demonstrate their commitment into the country by putting in at the very minimum $200,000. There is an exception to this, the minimum capital requirement. All rules have exceptions, as you know. The first one is, if you look at Article 9, the minimum capital is applicable for a single investment. It is a single investment. So if an investor is going to be engaged in different investments, say manufacturing on one side, agriculture on the other side, then it would require 2 different permits, and it would require to commit $200,000 for the agriculture and $200,000 for the manufacturing. It's per investment. So you could not just put in $200,000 and use that $200,000 for manufacturing, for agriculture, for ICT, and sort of use that in a way. It's to encourage a single investment, $200,000 in a single investment. Except, the exceptions there as well. If, for example, a manufacturing investor has come into the country, invested the minimum $200,000, made its profits, made all of its dividends, and wants to use that profit and dividend into another sector, say agricultural sector, it's a new investment. It will be considered as a new investment, but because it's using the profits that it's making, it's not taking it back, it's reinvesting it into the country, then it will not be required to commit the $200,000. That requirement will be waived because we want to encourage reinvestment into the country. We want as much as possible the investors to re-inject the profits they make into the country. So if they want to do that, then it does not have to be the $200,000, or that rule does not apply. The other investment is the board of directors of share companies. This is a bit of this article was inserted because of a practical challenge that board of directors were facing. In Ethiopia, as you know, our commercial code says that if you have a board of directors, all board members have to be shareholders into the company. So when individuals were trying to be a board director of the company, they were required to buy shares into the country. When they were trying to buy shares into an existing company, just to become a board of director, the investment commission was saying that no, this is a new investment, so you must commit $200,000. So that was creating a big of a practical issue. So a waiver was inserted, which says that if there is a board of director that is being set up, in which a PLC is turned into a share company, then the $200,000 will not be required. And the third exception is, say if there is a foreign investor that has come in, has paid the $200,000, has stayed into the country, has done all its investment, and wants to sell its business to another investor. That investment has fulfilled all the minimum requirements, has fulfilled all the requirements. So when it's selling to another investment, then the new investor will not be required to commit the $200,000 because the investment itself has fulfilled that initially when it came into the country. So if the new investor is acquiring the entirety of the company that has paid the first $200,000, then the new investor will not be required to pay that. Okay, so finally, we're running out of time. So just a summary of how today we talked about investment admission. Investment admission, so whenever you look into advising an investor, a new investor coming into Ethiopia and trying to really understand how the investment law works, things you should look into is, first of all, what's the sector that he wants to, does it fall under the investment law? Like I said, if it's petroleum, if it's mining, then you look into the other legislation. Then you look into whether the process is going to be handled by the Ethiopian Investment Commission. If it's energy, aviation, and communication, then you must also consult the other agencies. Is it a foreign investor or is it a domestic investor? So what is the nationality? You need to look into the nationality and the status of the investor to determine whether it's domestic or foreign. Like I said, if it's an Ethiopian diaspora, how does it want to be treated as a domestic investor or as a foreign? If it's a Djiboutian, how does it want to handle? So that the identity of the investor is important. And then once the identity is determined, then the sector that the investor wants to invest in has to also be looked into, whether it falls in any of these restrictions, into the sector listing under the regulation. When you read the regulation, you also need to pay attention to the exceptions within the regulation. The form of investment, how does the investor wants to invest? Is it setting up a new company, or is it going to be buying into an existing company? If that's the case, what are the requirements that he must fulfill? And finally, if it's going to be 100% owned by the foreign investor, if it's a new enterprise. If it's a brownfield investment, meaning investing into an existing company, buying shares of it, then it's automatically JV. Meaning if it's a local company, if it's a local company that's owned by domestic investors and the investor is coming, then the minimum capital will automatically be $150,000 because it will be considered as a joint venture. But if the foreign investor is investing in another foreign investment, owned by another foreign investor, then the minimum capital will still be $200,000 because it's not a joint venture with the domestic investors. It would be a partnership between two foreign investors. So these are the things that you need to consider when you try to address investment admission issues. Next class, we will discuss investment incentives, protections, and also investment administration. Any questions? We're running out of time, but
አብዛኞቹ ያመለከቱት ክትትልን አዶፕት አድርጓል የኢትዮጵያ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ለጅቡቲ የምንሰጠው በጠቅላላው በመሰረት ስታንድ ይሆናል ማለት ነው። ፕራክቲካሊ
it could be raised as an issue, but Djibouti is not considered as a foreign investor. MFN says within the same